wasn't designed to speak in general terms about human beings as lifeless lumps of clay over against God as the only living and thinking being. It was designed to speak very specifically about God's purpose in choosing and calling Israel, and about what could happen if Israel, like a lump of clay, failed to respond to the gentle moulding of his hands. It's a very beautiful thing, what Bishop Tom Wright says there. And it safeguards, of course, human freedom. Now we come to the fourth and final section, verses 22 to 29. Paul speaks firstly of God's patience towards the Jewish people, whom he calls vessels of wrath. They won't be, which is then contrasted with his glory shown to those whom he calls vessels of mercy. And they are us, we, Christians, followers of Jesus, the Messiah, both Jews and Gentiles. And again, Bishop Tom Wright reminds us that the prophets have spoken of a time of judgment that Israel has got to pass through. God's patience will run out. And a remnant will survive this judgment time. Obviously, this remnant are the vessels of mercy, the Christian community composed of Jewish people and Gentiles. The second thing that happens in these verses is that Paul says that this remnant community has been foretold to comprise of both Gentiles and Jews. And he uses two classic Old Testament texts to show us this. One is about Israel's divine sonship, to show how God intended to call into the people of God those who were originally not my people, that is, the Gentiles. And he uses more texts to show us that God is going to save a remnant of the Jewish people. What he's saying is that we can see, and Paul can see, and we can see how God planned this community of Jews and Christians if we look carefully back into Old Testament history. It's where the Old Testament is actually leading to this remnant community composed of Jews and Christians. Now we come to the final section, where we have some reflections on Israel's failure to respond. Paul tries to come to grips here with the failure of the Jewish people to respond to Christ in an honest way. That's Paul speaking as honestly as he can. He says that the failure is not because of the good news itself, but rather the way that the Jewish people have actually approached religion. He doesn't want to blame them for that. It's just the way things actually are. So, firstly, he says that Israel stumbles in its faith. Israel stumbles in its faith. That's a rather beautiful image for what he's trying to get across. It's an image of somebody racing along, and they stumble. And that's the fundamental difference. The Jews stumble and the Gentiles keep racing. And he uses a couple of texts which we can also see these two texts being reused in the first letter of St. Peter. So perhaps we think these texts that are coupled together have been used in Christian apologetics, and Paul just reuses this as Peter did. He uses these two texts to show us how the Jewish people themselves fell over this stumbling block. They relied on good deeds instead of trusting in faith. The stumbling block is Christ. They fell over that because they were relying on their good deeds. And rather beautifully, Paul comments, I have the very warmest love for the Jews, and I pray to God for them to be saved. But their zeal is misguided. They fail to recognize that righteousness comes from God. They fail to understand the true purpose of the law itself, which finds its fulfillment in Jesus. So Israel's failure really is essentially a misguided zeal, putting their hope in the law instead of seeing that the law, because they can't keep it, points them to need salvation from somewhere. And that somewhere, of course, is Christ. So the second thing in this section, Scripture itself speaks of righteousness by faith. Paul uses a text from Deuteronomy chapter 30 in a most attractive way to show us how beautiful faith really is and how easy it is if we just allow ourselves to live by faith rather than by trying to do the right thing, by trying to keep the law, etc. Those strange questions, who will ascend to heaven, who will descend into the abyss, are really pointing to what Christ has already done. He's come down from heaven and he's died for us. He ascended into the abyss. And then come those beautiful words. The word, that is, the faith we proclaim, is very near to you. It's on your lips and it's in your heart. If you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord, and if you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And this, of course, is the transformation of our hearts that the prophets in the times of the exile longed for. Create a clean heart for me, O Lord. And Ezekiel wanting a new heart. Paul concludes by saying that everybody who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Salvation is open to us all, Jews and Gentiles, if we really have faith. And the third section, Israel has heard the good news but hasn't responded. Now, so Paul's now rounding off all this section and he's saying that Israel hasn't really taken advantages of all the many opportunities it had. The gospel has been preached everywhere. The footsteps of those who bring good news is a welcome sound, and we've heard it. And yes, the apostolic preachers have done their job well. Their voice has gone through all the earth, and their message to the ends of the world. And yes, it has been well understood. And here, Paul is saying, just look at what the Gentiles have done. They've understood it so well, why couldn't you? The Gentiles who found Christ, even though they did not seek him, were, and then the Jewish people have a disobedient and obstinate heart because they didn't accept him. So we're struggling there with that very question of why the Jewish people rejected and why the Gentiles accepted. And he's saying the gospel has been preached. Everybody's had an opportunity. But some accepted and some refused. So if we look at these whole two chapters now, we can say this. The gospel has been preached to all of God's people. But perhaps their failure to respond